You've seen 100 videos like this before. You click on it expecting some new advice, but it's just the same old tips that only work on people below 500 ELO. I can tell you from experience because I've been there and I had to figure it out on my own. But what if I told you that after stagnating at 2000 rapid, I gained 100 ELO in 30 days with what I'm about to show you. In the last 30 days, I played 67 games. I won 40, I drew 2, and I lost 25. That's a win percentage of 60%. I did this not by improving my chess, but by reading my opponent. You probably do half of this already. When you make a move and your opponent's clock is ticking, you're probably already calculating what their best moves might be. This is great for time management because you're already thinking of the moves that you can potentially play in response to their moves. But something you're missing when you do this is you're not adjusting for the fact that your opponent is not you. You might be wondering, how on earth can I know how my opponent plays if I haven't even played a full game against them yet? Well, here are some things that you can do to better understand the game your opponent is playing before you've even played a full game against them. Let me introduce you to scouting. At the first chance you get, click on your opponent's profile. I'm not telling you to research their openings or anything. What they typically play will generally make no difference to how your game will go. You should be looking for two things on your opponent's profile. You should take notice of your opponent's peak rating. If they're currently at their peak, you could expect them to be nervous or inexperienced even. You can see my opponent here is only 30 ELO below their peak, but sometimes they can have a peak of over 200 ELO higher rated than they already are. If this is the case, maybe you should be cautious with the way that you play against them. Something else you can look for on your opponent's profile is roughly their last 5 games. You can see that my opponent here has drawn their last 2 games, so maybe in this game you could expect that they really want to win. They don't want to lose, and they most definitely don't want to draw a 3rd game in a row, so this is good information. They're going to be more aggressive than usual. They're not going to play as passively because they haven't experienced a win in 2 full rapid games. On the contrary, if this was a sea of red and they've lost a lot of games in a row, you can imagine that they're quite tilted, and maybe you should play in a specific way in the opening. Maybe you should play fast and induce a mistake in the opening because they're getting impatient of losing so much. These are all things that you can take into account just by briefly looking at the player's profile. Just a side note, I highly encourage you do this on your opponent's clock if you can. Open up a second tab to do this and only briefly look at this kind of information. Don't get too caught up into it. On top of this, if nothing stands out in this brief moment of scouting, just disregard it. Sometimes there's no good information to be found on an opponent. If this is the case, just continue the game like you normally would. If you're not already confident in your openings and find yourself taking a lot of time on simple moves, you will need to improve upon that before you start thinking about the opening press. The opening press is all about the clock. It's a massively underrated part of chess, and flagging your opponent is not the only use time management has. Let me give you an example. Let's say you begin your game with a simple move like d4, d5. This is incredibly straightforward to play, so play it. If you play the move d4 and your opponent takes, say, 5 seconds to respond with d5, play your next move immediately. If your opponent continues to leisurely take time on massively unimportant moves, press them on the clock. It might seem irrelevant to be only 15 to 20 seconds up out of the opening, but if you improve on your time management, those 15 to 20 seconds can be so much more valuable in other parts of the game. Any chess amateur will catch on to what you're doing pretty quickly. Flagging is all too common in modern chess, and they'll start to match your speed on the board. But what if I told you that the idea is not to flag your opponent? And what if I told you your opponent is far too late to realize your true intentions? The opening press is disguised as flagging, but in reality, it does a few things. Of course, number 1 is to flag your opponent at any given opportunity. No matter how drawn or equal a game is, if your opponent is down on the clock, they will always be on the back foot. This is poking your opponent, and it'll become a common theme throughout this video. If we give ourselves a 1% edge in multiple parts of the game, those eventually add up and become game winners. If your opponent is constantly on the back foot, you're pressuring them for time and thinking on their clock. they will eventually get nervous. I know it sounds kind of ridiculous, but have you ever been in one of those endgames where you end up winning with less than a second on the clock? Think about how much your heart raced in that game, and how maybe it's possible that other people get nervous for much less. People will become nervous or doubtful in their own chess ability, and that's the main point of the opening press. You want to lure your opponent into making a mistake because they are down on time. Here are a few examples of how this could occur in a game. This is a game that I played quite recently. I'm not going to go into the intricacies of the game, but as you can see, I'm roughly a minute up. My opponent tries to match my speed and immediately makes a mistake with b4. I respond with bishop takes h5, and then I unleash a deadly attack on his king side. I win his queen, and shortly after that, I mate my opponent. It is mate in 2 from this position. Of course, that could just be a one-off thing, but let's look here. I'm a minute up against my opponent here. They are 2,188 rated. And they take my f5 pawn with their rook, and they end up blundering mate in 5, which I find on the board. Again, here is someone rated roughly 2100, and I'm up almost 30 seconds on the clock. They make a mistake, and I find g4. After takes, this knight will not be defended by this knight anymore because the pawn kicks it out, and white simply wins this position. Here I play against the 2150, and after playing quickly, they blunder their knight. They think that after bishop takes, queen takes, they're gonna fork my pieces, but I can just step out the way with my queen and I'm completely winning. They castle, I take their knight, and this is a completely winning game for black. Now, it's very easy to assume that these things are not correlated. I mean, people make blunders all the time, and I'm not that much up on time in these positions. Well, you'd be right. Blunders like this do happen all the time, and the point of the opening press is to increase the amount of times this will happen by putting your opponent in uncomfortable situations constantly. People don't like being pressed for time. It makes them uncomfortable, and they can't even think clearly when it's their clock that is constantly ticking. But you need to know that every game is different. Sometimes this won't work. Your opponent will play solid and you'll be on your own essentially. But again, having these things in your back pocket will always give you an edge if your opponent has nothing up their sleeve. The third and final thing you can do that I've learned is to read your opponent. The most common way of being able to read your opponent in any position is if they try to trade queens. This either means they're completely winning and want to trade down, or they're scared of your potential threats. This is obvious though, everyone knows this, but there are so many other ways to read your opponent and play moves accordingly. I'll list a few ways that you can read your opponent. Suspicious delaying of castling. If your opponent does this, assume they don't intend on castling, or maybe they want to castle on the opposite side of you. Immediate opposite side castling. People who immediately castle on the opposite side of you have likely not calculated at all. They do this because it creates chaotic games. Sometimes they don't even do basic counting to calculate whose king falls under immediate threat first. If your opponent does this, start to take some time to think. The game could end in 10 moves. Hastily trading pieces. People don't hastily trade pieces for no reason. I can say this from experience because I trade my pieces at any given chance I get. This is because I know I'm an extremely strong endgame player. I can beat over 70% of my opponents in any endgame position, even if the engine thinks it's a draw. Think about this when you trade. If the endgame arrives, are you good enough to win it? Unexplainably long time usage. This might be the most useful read of all. If your opponent takes an unexplainably long time to play a move, then plays a simple waiting move like h3, it usually means one thing. They calculated a long line and got really invested into it, only to realize it doesn't work. I'm sure we've all been in this position, and we can all agree it's extremely demoralizing to put so much effort into a single line only to realize it doesn't work. You should punish your opponent for this. Send a waiting move back to them like h3 and make their clock tick instead of yours, and it'll put the pressure on them again. The list of these endgame reads is endless. If you take away one thing from this, take away the fact that nothing happens for no reason. People don't play moves for no reason, and people don't take a lot of time on moves for no reason. People are not engines. Take advantage of that fact. Constantly ask yourself why in every game you play. You'd be surprised by how much logic you can give to seemingly mundane things to give yourself an edge. It's exactly what I've been doing in my games, and it's how I gained 100 elo in 30 days.